All right, good morning everyone. Today, I think we're going to have a great discussion, particularly afterwards. So if there are people out there who are still interested in showing up, I think it's going to be a great conversation once we get through the service. Today we're going to talk about diversity, and specifically how diversity is useful. I think a lot of times people hear diversity as a buzzword as opposed to something that is inherently valuable. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to talk about optionality, which is kind of a word we made up in terms of preserving options for humanity going forward, and how that all ties into our survival as a species. So yesterday, I spent the day driving over with John to Jackson, Mississippi, and I personally went to get some perspective, right? So clearly from the video, and for those of you who are in the room, I appear to be a white male in the United States of America. So my perspective is limited to my perspective, right? And that's true for each of us individually. So I went to Jackson, Mississippi, which is a place that's predominantly black or African American, to see what they see. And we were going to meet with a group of people who have started a worker-run collective, 4 of them actually, to try and provide for the people in that city, jobs, economy, etc., because it doesn't exist there in the way it does in other places. And I went there to see what that looks like, what it feels like. Went to talk to them about their perspective. And I would have to say that I definitely walk away with some. So specifically, I wanted to know a little bit about their background, their experiences, and particularly their view from the racial perspective. Because I can't know that. No matter how much I read or try and understand, it's almost impossible for me to know. So I went to ask. I think that in itself is really important, that we learn to ask other people's perspectives. And so why I think this is important to us, because in a way, this gathering, the idea behind creating a humanist church was to create community, and not just community of people who are like us, right, where we have a fairly uniform perspective, but to bring people together who disagree, to bring people together from which we can learn. So we have to, I think, in our daily lives, figure out how we can gain perspective, and we can only really gain significant perspective, I think, from people who are different from us. Otherwise, we get the echo chamber, right? We all agree with each other, we move on in terms of decision making, and there's nothing to correct an error. So I want to first start by talking about what is diversity, right? I think a lot of times today we talk about diversity training and inclusion of different groups of people, right? So just because you include people doesn't mean that you are now diverse in terms of an organization or whatever it is. Because if you're not listening to them, then their diversity isn't contributing, right? So a lot of people define diversity in terms of differences, right? Whether it's race, gender, sexuality, ability and disability, economic upbringing, so class. But I think there are many other dimensions of diversity, and to me it all comes down to experience, but those experiences are often shaped by our physical characteristics. One of those things that I think we often don't think about is exposure to conflict. So having been in the military and having been to places like Afghanistan where I've been exposed to conflict, and we hear about stories from people who have seen war or seen death or seen suffering in their household growing up. And I think those experiences are some of the most valuable. And it's not just the ones from war, but even in terms of being discriminated against, being hated, being ostracized. Understanding what it is like to be on the outside is an invaluable perspective, particularly for people who have never had it. And oftentimes those exposures to conflict allow us to see the world from a broader perspective. There's a story that was related to me about people who work in the special operations community, right? So they live on the front lines of war, oftentimes in places that we don't even talk about. And when they come back from that, I have heard that they often question which world is real. Is the world that we live in here in the United States with our first world problems the real world? Or is it the case that on the front lines of battle, struggling against evil and corruption and seeing death and destruction and disease, is that the real world? And in the conversation I've heard, they think that's the real world. So imagine having a bit of that perspective in shaping how we design policy and how we provide for people. So when we're talking about diversity, the physical characteristics do help us. They help us identify someone who might at least have a perspective different from our own. And it's a way to attempt to include people who are different. But we have to be careful that we're not just looking for diversity of colors, diversity of sexuality, all the easily categorizable ways that we're different. We also have to look for diversity in experience, in mindset. I mean, this is as simple as having someone who's introverted versus extroverted, someone who's analytical versus emotional. Now, some people might say, well, why does that matter, right? That seems nice, everyone gets a say, but how is that better for us? How do we use these differences? So if you've ever heard about brainstorming, one of the things you likely have heard about brainstorming is that anybody can throw out an idea and that we should not criticize ideas, right? Have you all heard that? When you're brainstorming, you don't criticize? Turns out that if you do a scientific experiment to see whether dissent is or is not valuable, that is wrong. It is in fact better for the decision-making process and generating better, more useful ideas if you are allowed to dissent and criticize. So researcher Charlene Nemeth, there's a book called In Defense of Troublemakers, and then there's also a LA Times article by Sunstein specifically about creating dissent. So it's counterintuitive, right? It might think like, oh, well, we want to be in a relatively safe environment where people don't feel criticized for throwing out ideas. And that's true in the sense that we should not be overly negative or harsh on people, right? So we can look at an idea and say, I don't understand why that would work. And that forces them to then refine that idea. But the underlying bit of information here is that dissent helps us make better decisions. And it's very difficult to have dissent if everyone thinks in the same way. If we all start from a fundamental set of assumptions that says, oh, well, this kind of people are just lazy, and therefore we should not provide for their basic needs, if there is no one from that group included, then you have really no idea about that group. And you might have someone say, well, wait a minute, having been in that situation, I know that that's not the case because humans almost always want to have meaningful work. And if we provided for their basic needs, it would allow them to advance their education, et cetera, et cetera. That's where dissent gets us. And that's what diversity provides. One of the pieces I mentioned in there that seeking opinions different from your own helps you hone your own ideas. So being a humanist, an agnostic, and what I would call a practicing atheist, I operate as if an interventionist God does not exist. People question me. And in questioning me over the years, I have been forced to refine how I think about my ideas. In having a discussion with a Christian gentleman who came up to us at the World Religion Day, he had asked some questions about truth, right? The idea of objective truth. And in having that conversation, it forced me to realize that I don't find objective truth to be a useful construct. There's what I would call functional truth, what we all agree upon to be true. But if you get into the really, really deep philosophical arguments, objective truth doesn't really mean much. right? So, but only through that confrontation was I able to refine that idea. It's the idea of the crucible of battle, or whatever it happens to be, of argument. It's the fire that helps us purify our ideas. So not only does it help us to refine our ideas and make better decisions, right? Because that's effectively red teaming your ideas, right? You ask yourself, how could this be wrong? Instead of saying, well, clearly I'm right. So it helps you to see the holes and the flaws. But beyond that, it maximizes optionality. Like I said, this is a made-up word for us. It's the idea of preserving options, of preserving choice in the future. So if we think about it like a path with branches, right? So in terms of humanity, it's on a path. And right now we have a number of branches available in the path ahead of us. But if we decrease diversity, we decrease the type of people who are going to come up with ideas, then we likely are going to have fewer ideas to choose from. So in the future, if the majority of those paths lead to a dead end, and we have unintentionally or even intentionally cut off something that we did not feel we should include in our diverse set of options, then we may have nowhere to go. When you look at the world, and even in terms of the economy today, we live in an idea economy. It's not about just producing anymore. It's about thinking of something different. Creativity. And uniformity isn't a good driver of creativity. And when it comes to humanity, that is even more important. The idea of whether or not we are going to survive is contingent upon us coming up with ideas to solve ever more difficult problems. How are we going to solve the fact that the world is getting too hot with too much CO2? How are we going to protect ourselves from space-based threats? How are we going to de-escalate nuclear war? How are we going to intervene with deadly disease? Just this morning, I was reading an article about how in Kenya, broad access to antibiotics that are extremely misused is creating drug-resistant bacteria. The fact that there are countries around the world who have a significantly lower standard of health than us. Most people would say, well, why do we care about what's happening in Kenya? Well, if the next world or humanity erasing disease comes from there, I think we should care. But we aren't including in conversations the perspective from Kenya, at least not in the US, outside of probably small circles in the CDC. So the survival of humanity is dependent on the inclusion of ideas from those different from us, because that then maximizes our optionality. And so I wonder what would happen if all of the different groups in the world had the time, the leisure to invent, to create, to think differently. Where would we be today? Because there are people that are going to have ideas that I can't. I just am incapable of having because I have not seen what they've seen. I've not experienced what they've experienced. So how are we capitalizing on that? Well, first I want to address how we failed to do this. Because I think it's very important for us who have power, who are affluent, to realize that we have it, and to realize that we need to do something. So on the way over to Jackson, I was listening to a podcast called Confronting Racism. So the podcast is actually the NPR TED Radio Hour, which is a fantastic program. And the specific one I was listening to was called Confronting Racism. And this is something I've known and have discussed before, that we're all biased or prejudiced in some way, right? That's just a fact of being human, right? It doesn't mean, even if you're racist, and I would say that I'm racist in the way that I have been programmed to react to certain visual images or things in my life based on media, upbringing, etc. Right? If I go into a lower income neighborhood, and I was talking with John about this yesterday, where there are a bunch of unemployed men who statistically are going to tend to be black, that sets off warnings in my head from things that I've been told. Someone's going to steal your car. Someone's going to hold you up, right? And unless I hold those biases in my head and say, these are the biases that I am feeling right now, then I have no way to counteract them. This is our problem. And this is not a white problem. It's not an American problem. It's not a Western problem. Those are symptoms. The problem is that we're human. Humans categorize things. It's how we process information more quickly. We are designed to put things into chunks and groups and say these are good and these are bad. Right? Sour and bitter things are bad because they indicate poison. Sweet things are good because they indicate nutrition and calories. Things that are big and dark are scary and bad. Things that are light and calming are good. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, right? When we're detecting threats and our lives were fragile, more so than they are today, we needed those things to make rapid decisions on life or death. But in a society where we're neighbors, and where we should at least have the common goal to advance the human story, those things may not be useful. There are a lot of things about being human that are no longer useful. The idea that we like sweet things, right? That's caused us to have a significant health crisis in the US, right? So it made sense, 50,000 years ago, but doesn't make sense now. We need to control those things. We need to use our front brain to say that's not a useful construct anymore. The same thing when it comes to emotional arguments or being caught up in fake news, right? Actual fake news, not what everybody calls fake news. News is not fake news, but fake news is fake news. So there are all of these constructs that we have that are no longer useful. But if we don't hold them in front of ourselves to say that these are the constructs that are being created in my head, how are we ever going to fix them? So realizing that most of us are racist is an important first start. And prejudiced and biased. Just think about the language we use, right? When I remember growing up, we used to say, oh, that's gay, as a parallel for bad. Now, thankfully, that's changed over the years. But culturally, that's been programmed in many of our heads that word is synonymous with bad or different, which also means bad. So what things are we programmed to think? And they're subconscious, right? So one of the things that they talked about in this podcast was that a lot of white people have, in stressful situations, a reflex that locks down their brain into the fight or flight mode when they experience encounters with black people, particularly those they feel threatened by. And they theorize that psychological process then drives the police violence against black people. Or when you see people, calling in the police on someone who lives at an apartment complex, it doesn't excuse those people from doing it just because they had a brain lockdown, because to me, it's their responsibility to, again, hold their biases in front of them. But part of the problem is that as white people, we've been taught that racism is bad, which we would all agree. So therefore, to accuse someone of being racist is an attack on their moral character. But that's not actually true. That has nothing to do with their moral character. It has to do, to me, more with laziness. The fact that they've not held their biases in front of them and say, yes, I have these. So to be racist or to be prejudiced isn't to be a bad person. To not act on correcting those things, to me, is to be the bad person. We're all prejudiced. We're all biased. We're all human. We categorize things. And if we start from there, we can, I think, break down this idea that well, I'm colorblind. Well, that just means you ignore racism as opposed to addressing it. I don't see color. That's bullshit. We all see color, and we're all affected by it. And we're affected by difference, and we're affected by perceptions. So I really want us to fight against the idea of color blindness or gender blindness or whatever. Blindness is taking information away from yourself to make good decisions. And that's, to me, that's just stupid. So instead, we need to say to ourselves, yes, I am biased, I am prejudiced. How does it affect me? How can I counteract it? How can I gain perspective to reprogram my brain? Going to Jackson, driving around, thinking about these things, I'm thinking to myself, my brain is being racist right now. I am stereotyping the people walking down the street. I'm stereotyping the type of buildings and the street conditions that I'm seeing. I'm stereotyping what I think my encounters might be. And I'm stereotyping them to be potentially more violent, more threatening. That's what I'm feeling. But if I hold it in front of myself and say, I know this is irrational, I know that I have been programmed like this, then I can hold on to that rear brain and say, calm down. Let's give this a shot. Because statistically, nothing's going to happen, right? Statistically, I'll be just fine, regardless of what neighborhood I'll drive through. But we have this fear, the story we tell ourselves, that somebody different from us is out to do us harm. I would say that's what most of our politics today are based on. Fear of the other. And so it's up to us, and we start with the individual, with ourselves, by saying, I will choose not to be afraid. I will choose to have courage and put myself in situations that are uncomfortable and different so that I can gain the right perspective to then make good decisions. So one of the ways we do this is, through structural inequities, right? So people always talk about, people I've talked to, family even, well, if they just worked harder, they would do just fine. And that's a really naive position to take, right? And a lot of it's based on our own experiences. So I worked very hard growing up. We grew up relatively poor. We were on food stamps a couple of times. And I have worked hard to get where I am. But I'm also white. I never had to think about my race. And if race is too touchy a subject for you, think about it in terms of sexual assault. We had this conversation the other day here. What do men do on a daily basis to protect themselves from sexual assault? Spoiler alert, the answer is nothing. We might take steps to protect ourselves from general harm, staying out of bad areas, but we do not think about being assaulted or raped on a daily basis. We just don't. It's not a thing we have to think about. And I would say that for white people, they don't have to think about race. I heard a really great story once, and I can't remember from who. And it was about a women's group, and there was a black woman in the group, and there was a white woman in the group who was questioning, why do you see things as a race thing? And the black woman asked the white woman, what do you see when you look in the mirror? And the white woman said, I see a white woman. Or actually, no, I take that back. She said, I see a woman. But the black woman says, yes, but when I look in the mirror, I see a black woman. And then if you ask a man what they see in a mirror, they just say either a man or a person, right? White man is the default for human in our minds. And it's the other groups that have to put modifiers on them to explain who they are. So I think this is important for us to realize that there are so many things we, particularly in the US, but even among different groups, that we don't even have to think about. Therefore, it takes groups who are different from the stereotype or the perceived norm. They have to spend extra time doing what we take for granted. People of different sexual orientations or gender may have to spend extra time dressing themselves a certain way so that they're perceived as they want to be perceived. or people of different races have to take care around the police or employers, or change how they engage to fit the mold. So they have to spend more time. They're effectively wasting their time because of the structural inequities in the system. Then you look at the idea of education, right? Desegregation happened in the mid 1900s, and yet schools today are more segregated than ever because there's no forcing mechanism to force rich people and poor people to live in the same proximity. And I'm not saying that would be the answer, right? But there's been a de facto segregation of schools based on money. So those people then have to spend more time and more of their resources trying to get their children the education required to be functional in today's society. When you look at the rates of incarceration for black people in particular, they're far, far higher than any other group, right? So we're literally taking their time away by putting them in prison, a lot of times for nonviolent offenses. As we talked about last week, time is the most precious resource we have. And if we're taking time away and we have rules in place that take the time away from groups of people, we're not capitalizing on their capability, on their diversity, on their perspective. So how do we get after this? How do we start to break down these inequities? Like I said, I think it starts with the individual. One, reflect on how you are biased or prejudiced. That's going to take just a little bit of sitting and thinking, but it's also going to take putting yourself with those groups of people and then listening to yourself. What things are popping into my head? Am I thinking about threats? Am I thinking about countermeasures? Am I thinking about securing my belongings? Am I thinking about how this makes me feel uncomfortable? Am I talking with someone whose gender I can't identify, and I'm worried about making a misstep, and so I'm uncomfortable by that, and I want to retreat? Do you have that feeling? And if you do, it's okay that you have a feeling. The feeling itself doesn't make you a bad person, right? You can't control the feelings you have, but you do control what you do about them. So if we experience the feeling, let's ask ourselves why. Why is this? And then engage in conversation. And sometimes it's going to be hard, and sometimes those people are going to perceive that you're being nosy or pushy, right? Or insensitive. But from my perspective, I will take that risk. I will risk offending someone so that I might better understand. Because to me, we're all human, and we have to be working on the same team. So confront it and hold it in your mind as you engage. And then when we come to better understand these groups, we have to speak out on their behalf. We're not the heroes, right? No one's going to come in and save another group. You know, the sort of old Disney trope of the Prince Charming coming in and saving the princess. But we can be the enablers, the supporters. We can help to level the playing field. We can let them know that they're not alone, that we're all human. And we have to realize that majority groups design systems that benefit themselves, right? So when we look at the way our power structures are built, politics, for instance, politics are built and reinforced to support the two-party system, period. And neither of those two-party systems, I think, do a terrific job of really addressing minority issues. I think one leans that way more than the other, but when you look at the actual structural change that occurs when one or the other is in power, the difference is not as significant as we might hope. So that means that those power structures are simply reinforcing what already gets them reelected, right? And unless we hold them accountable, that will not change. Now, in the world that preceded us, 100 years ago to 100,000 years before that, the world had scarce resources. Now, we still think that the resources are scarce, right? We're programmed to think that. But there have been studies that have shown that there's more than enough housing to put people in. There's more than enough resources to feed everybody on the planet. With smart engagement and prevention, we can provide medical services for the vast majority of people in the world. But that's not how power is currently allocated or distributed. So realistically, if we stop to think about it, if we look at what we have enough. We are post-scarcity. So therefore, the mindset of hoarding doesn't make any sense anymore. Because we're at the point where hoarding, I think, is actually hurting us. Because if you want to put it in strictly economic terms, it's uninvested capital, right? So if you have money in the bank, unless you have it in a really good savings account or money market or a CD, you're losing money to inflation, right? You're losing purchasing power to inflation. To me, it is exactly the same with the resources we have on this planet. We're in the idea economy now, and we are holding ourselves back from getting new ideas by not investing in communities that have different perspectives. Look at some of the leadership of some of the companies, the major companies in the US. Where do they come from? Not the US. The leaders of Google, Apple, Microsoft, they're all different in some way than the standard. Many of them came from India. Why? Because their family, their structure, their parents invested in education. They capitalized on someone who had seen something different, came from a different culture, had a different perspective. What other ideas are locked into groups who are not the mainstream because we are underinvesting in them? And then, of course, assume people who are different have something of value to say. This can be done in your daily life. You might think you have the best idea, and I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else. You might think you have the best idea. And you say, all right, this is the idea, here's where we're going to go. Instead, ask somebody else, what do you think? And even if you're right and your idea is good, and they come up with an idea that's different or crazy or whatever, they might help you to refine that idea to make it even better. Or they might give you the idea that saves you from some terrible mistake. That's the value of someone else's opinion. My time in Afghanistan, Afghanistans are not a well-educated people, right? So their country is still in shambles. They don't have a robust education system, but they are not stupid people. They are savvy, they are survivors. And they see things that we don't. And I learned that in my time there. People would denigrate them because they live in, what we would consider hovels, and there's trash everywhere, and kids run around with bare feet. But I see in them the same thing I see in my family. The kids run around and play, despite their severe lack of resources. They still have fun. They want to provide for their family, and they're going to do it how they can. And they're not suckers. They're exceptional bargainers. They understand the value of things. So never discount someone just because you don't think they can contribute. And again, advocate for those without power. First, it's right, not in the sense of it's politically correct right or whatever it is. It's right because it gives us different perspectives that might help tip the balance of saving humanity. And in terms of the church perspective, the church ideology, that's the infinite right thing to do. That's the ethics that the church advocates for, saving humanity. So it's right for that reason. And then second, a little bit more short-term self-serving. You never know when power dynamics are going to shift. And we should operate by the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. Some of you may be familiar with the German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller. And if you're not, I'm going to read to you a passage from him, and I'll bet you recognize it. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Now, I imagine most of you have heard some version of that. So he was put in an internment camp for speaking out for people during World War II. If we don't speak out for the people who don't have power, what happens when the tyrants take power and finally when it comes to us, there's no one left to speak for us? So next week on Saturday, we'll be out supporting the People Acting for Change and Equality Pride in the Park event, which starts at 11 o'clock, again next Saturday at Betty Virginia Park. And we will go speak out for those who want to express their gender and their sexuality differently. And we will go to speak out on behalf of diversity. And in doing so, we will speak out for ourselves and all of humanity. Thank you.